The Great Siege of Malta by Francisco Balbi, Chapter 4. The enemy lays siege to St. Elmo and Dragut joins the Turkish fleet. Friday the 25th of May. The enemy now began to transport their main artillery from the fleet to St. Elmo. This was a very difficult task, for the guns were heavy. Their wheels and carriages were made of iron, and they had to take them a distance of 9 miles over very rocky and stony ground. Unfortunately, the serfs and beasts of burden that the Maltese had left behind in the countryside proved to be of the greatest help. From the spur of St. Michael, we could see 10 or 12 oxen, as well as many men harnessed to ropes, pulling the guns. As soon as the Grand Master saw the Turkish artillery on its way to St. Elmo, he sent 100 knights of all nationalities over to the fortress. Colonel Mass and Lamotte, together with their men, were also sent to reinforce the garrison. 12 galley slaves from each of the 5 galleys were also sent over and provided with arms and tools so that they could either fight or labour. They were given good pay for their part in the defence. La Valette gave orders that all women and children and old people who had taken shelter in the ditch around St. Elmo should be sent over to Birgu. Only men who were fit to fight or work were to be kept there. The result was that when the Turks attacked the fort, there were 800 fighting men defending it. He provisioned the garrison with biscuits, wine, cheese, salt pork, vegetables, oil, and vinegar. As for fresh meat, they had the island cattle which had been kept in the ditch around the fort. There was a fresh water pool nearby, but since they would not be able to use it, the defenders threw salt into it. The Grand Master also sent over powder, lead rope, combustibles, and explosive fireworks, as well as everything else that would be needed. Sunday the 26th of May. The enemy began to entrench themselves at little more than 600 paces from the ditch surrounding St. Elmo on the Marsa-Macheto side. This was a very hard task, for the ground was all rock, yet they worked so well that before long they were close to the scarp of the ditch itself. On account of the direction from which they had approached, they could not be seen from St. Elmo and so were unmolested. Soon their entrenchment was as usual decorated with flags. They also erected wooden triangular frames which were filled with earth to form platforms and defences for the guns with which they intended to destroy St. Elmo's walls on that side of the peninsula. Juan de la Cerda now crossed over to Birgu and reported to the Grand Master. He told him that it was impossible to defend St. Elmo because of its obvious weaknesses. La Valette thanked him for his information, but replied that he felt sure he and his men would do their duty. He added that he would send reinforcements whenever he considered it to be necessary. In order to put heart into him, the Grand Master said that when he thought the garrison of St. Elmo could hold out no longer, he himself would come over with fresh troops to defend it. Soon after this, La Valette sent Captain Madrano with his company to supplement the garrison. It was on this day that the Turks uncovered 2 gun platforms on the land above St. Elmo. One of them faced the windmills on the peninsula of St. Michael, opposite the post of Don Francisco de Sanaguera, and the other faced St. Angelo. It was clear that the first would be used to bombard the windmills and the spur, as well as the whole peninsula, while the other would command the sea passage where the galleys and boats passed between Birgu and St. Michael. Seeing the enemy's intentions, the Grand Master ordered the 2 galleys, the St. Gabriel and the Corona, to be scuttled. The other 2 galleys and the St. John were safe in the ditch behind St. Angelo. Sunday the 27th of May. The Calabrian renegade, Akalifatus, joined the Turkish fleet today, bringing with him 4 ships and 600 Levantine troops. Also on this Sunday, Admiral Piali, while he was inspecting the trenches, was hit by a splinter of rock thrown up by a cannonball, but the wound was not mortal. The 2 gun platforms on Mount Shibarus were already completed, and during the night the Turks brought their siege guns into position. Before beginning the bombardment, the Turkish arquebuses were told that they must all combine in a fusillade on our positions that night. Any man who was absent from his post would receive 100 strokes on the belly. They kept up this general fire for a long time, and as soon as it was over, opened up with heavy guns which had been trained on our positions. No great damage was done, however, for we were on the alert, having seen the Turks clearing away their gun ports. Most of this information I got from a young Spaniard, an Andalusian called Alfonso. He was with the Turkish army and had taken part in this action. He was furthermore secretary to the ruler of Algiers and tutor to his son. This night during the bombardment, he managed to escape to St. Elmo, for he wished to return to the true faith of his fathers. He put on his best clothes, as well as 2 shirts, and took with him all the money he could. As soon as the bombardment ceased, he made his way down to the seashore, where there was a cave from which the Turks used to fire upon our boats. Being challenged by their sentries, he told them that he was going to have a shot at the boats which were passing between Birgu and St. Elmo. The sentries asked him why he was wearing his burners, and he answered that he intended to spend the night there and sleep out in the open. He then fired several shots in the air to lull their suspicion, and immediately the chance presented itself, he went to the walls of St. Elmo and called out he was near the drawbridge. An Italian sentry replied, "What is it?" Now it happened that this is also a Turkish phrase, so Alfonso suspected that the Turks had somehow got into St. Elmo. Shortly afterwards, when our fire had died down, for we returned the Turkish fire, 2 knights saw him and asked who he was and what he wanted. "I am a Spaniard," he replied, "and I want to come into the fort." The 2 knights went off and told the bailiff of Negrepont. It was thought dangerous to lower the drawbridge at such a time, so a rope was thrown over the wall for him to climb up into the fort. Alfonso tied his arquebus, his burnous, and other belongings to the rope, which was then hauled up, and afterwards he climbed up the rope himself. It was from Alfonso that we learned about the quarrel between the 2 pashas, Mustafa and Piali, and of discontent throughout the army and the fleet. We also found out from him that the next morning the Turks intended to destroy our big culverin, which was mounted on the tower. They would be able to do so quite easily, he said, for they had a Genoese renegade among them who was a master gunner. Alfonso advised us to move the culverin before this should happen. Alfonso was now sent to see the Grand Master in Birgu, where he repeated everything that he told the bailiff. He went on to say that if Valette thought fit, he would return to the Turkish camp at once and set fire to a large ammunition dump whose whereabouts he knew, saying that it would be quite simple to do. La Valette would not give him permission to go at the time, but the following night he asked Alfonso if he still wanted to put his plan into action. The Spaniard replied that it was then too late, for he would have been marked as absent by this time and would certainly be killed if he went back. The Grand Master was pleased at his reply because he knew now that he was an honest man. This same Alfonso fought well throughout the siege and was wounded during the battles for St. Michael and Castile. After all was over, La Valette kept him in his service, employing him as a Turkish and Moorish interpreter, since he wrote and spoke both of these languages very well. Monday the 28th of May. The Turks now opened fire on St. Elmo from the platform which they had built on the Marsa Macheto side of the peninsula. From one of the 2 platforms on the heights above St. Elmo, they also opened fire on the post held by Don Francisco de Sanaguera, as well as on the windmills, the houses and the boats. From the other gun platform, they started to bombard the battery of Francisco de Guaral, the one sited near the Great Chain. But seeing that their fire was without effect, they turned their attention to St. Angelo. De Guaral's battery being at water level, they hoped that they could make the rock and stone above his post fall down and crush it, but as soon as any debris fell, Commander de Guaral had it rapidly cleared away. Since the wall above him was very old, a great deal of it did in fact collapse. This greatly encouraged the Turks, but they would have to have knocked down about 30 arms lengths of rock before they could have done any real damage. All the dogs in the island had been brought into Birgu and St. Michael, and their continual barking during the night disturbed the sentries. For this reason, as well as to prevent their owners sharing their rations with them, the Grand Master had them all destroyed. Meanwhile, the work on our defences went steadily ahead, the engineers building a parapet from the post of Aragon to Bormla, which they knew was a weak point. The inner side of this parapet was filled with earth, but where it was too close to the main wall, it was cut away. Gabriel Gort, a Catalan knight, who is now commander of Tortosa, was in charge of this post. Throughout the siege, as well as on the other occasions, he had always been a staunch defender of the order. We noticed that the Turks were building a very large gun platform on the high ground above St. Elmo, and it seemed clear that this was designated for bombarding the fort, even though it was over 1,000 paces away. At the same time, they were steadily improving their position at the counterscarp of the ditch, which they trimmed down so that its height should not interfere with their gunnery. Throughout this period, the Grand Master never slept. He was like another Argus with 100 eyes, inspecting, supervising, and giving advice wherever necessary. The moment he saw the large gun platform that the Turks were preparing, he gave orders that some small houses in St. Angelo, which stood opposite to it, should be demolished. He then ordered a battery to be mounted at the point where the houses had stood, with the intention of bombarding the Turks from it. This new battery on St. Angelo would certainly have interfered with the construction of their gun platform if it could have been made ready in time. Unfortunately, despite the Grand Master's efforts, the Turks were ready before us. This was due to the fact that they had so large a labour force, as well as the great number of beasts of burden that the Maltese had left out in the country. Another reason for the Turkish efficiency and speed was that they had brought the materials and components for their gun batteries ready-made from Constantinople. Nevertheless, La Valette pressed ahead with the work, and as soon as it was finished, had 4 cannons mounted on it. With these he inflicted considerable damage on the enemy, and if only he'd have had enough ammunition, it is very likely that the Turks would not have been able to build their gun platforms as easily as they did. The Grand Master had plenty of artillery, both from the galleys and the other ships, but he did not have sufficient gunpowder, and was therefore obliged to husband his resources for the moment when the main attack should begin. Tuesday the 29th of May. The enemy's main fire was directed against the defences of St. Elmo, especially the tower held by Commander Sagra. The windmills of St. Michael were the target for the new batteries on the promontory of St. Elmo, as were the boats passing between Birgu and St. Angelo. The Turks also bombarded the houses at the same time as they busied themselves on their big main gun platform. So well prepared were they for all eventualities. Even when some of their guns were put out of action by the fire from St. Elmo, it was not long before they had them going again. Wednesday the 30th of May. The Turkish fleet sailed from Marsa to take on waters in the bays of Selina and St. Paul. As they passed in front of Fort St. Elmo, each galley fired 2 rounds, and some of them more. Their fire was returned by St. Angelo and St. Elmo, and one of the galleys which had got too close to St. Elmo was hit between wind and water. If the others had not gone to her assistance, she would have sunk. At the same time, the fleet towed a number of barges laden with fascines for making defences and other materials into St. George's Bay and left them there. The idea was that their barges would be able to coast round quietly by night into Marsamachetto harbour and unload by their camp on the shore. This was within range of Birgu and St. Angelo, and if the culverin on the tower commanded by Sagra could have been used, it would have done them great harm. Unfortunately, this was impossible because of the tower's weakness, so the cannon was removed before the Turks could destroy it. The enemy finished their large gun platform today and withdrew from their positions facing St. Michael. Already some of their guns were in position on the main platform, and during the night all the others were brought up. There were 17 of them in all, and judging by the noise they made, they were heavy pieces. Thursday the 31st of May. On this day, the feast of the Ascension of our Lord, the Turks opened fire from their main battery, as well as with the guns they had withdrawn from their position facing St. Michael. There were now 24 guns altogether in action against Fort St. Elmo. Some bombarded the post of Colonel Mass, the area between the spur on the Marsamachetto side and the spur near the church. Others engaged Commander Sagra's tower, reckoning to do a great deal of damage. The commander and his knights and soldiers did all they could to strengthen the tower, as well as repairing it where necessary. The Grand Master sent a succession of boats across so as to keep himself informed of the situation up to the minute, as well as to provide whatever was needed for the defence. Whenever they were able to open fire, the garrison of St. Elmo did their utmost against the enemy, and when they could no longer work their guns, they busied themselves on the defences. Friday the 1st of June. The enemy bombardment continued. It was as heavy as on the previous day, and indeed, so unceasing was their fire that it was clear that they never cleaned their guns or allowed them to cool in the normal manner. They relied no doubt on the great weight of their firepower, and throughout the bombardment, La Valette was kept constantly informed of the effect it was having. During this stage of the siege, Work went on night and day in Birgu and St. Michael. The captain of each position made whatever improvements were necessary to his fortifications. Some were raising walls, others building parapets and fighting positions, while yet others were raising the ground level with barrels of earth, or levelling it off, whichever was necessary. Saturday the 2nd of June. Dragut joined the Turkish fleet. He came with 13 galleys and 2 galleots of his own, as well as about 30 ships belonging to other corsairs. Some 2,500 volunteers from the western shores of North Africa were in this fleet, and Admiral Piali went out in his galley to meet them. He led them into St. George's Bay, where Dragut set up his headquarters before going to meet Mustafa Pasha. The Turks were naturally overjoyed by the arrival of Dragut, but later we learned that Dragut himself was infuriated when he found out that the bombardment of St. Elmo had already begun. His own views were similar to Mustafa Pasha's, and had he been present at the Great Council they would have triumphed, which would have been disastrous for us. However, accepting the fact that the attack was already in progress, Dragut at once made suggestions for improving it, as was only to be expected from so experienced a warrior and a corsair of his calibre. His intervention proved greatly to our detriment. Sunday the 3rd of June. Dragut returned his galleys which were lying in St. George's Bay, to the west of St. Elmo, and on the other side of Marsa Macheto, he began to build a gun platform on a high point known as the Hermitage of St. Mary. Although this new battery was 600 paces away, he started to bombard the Ravelin and the Tower of Sagra from it. Astute and shrewd as always, he kept a good lookout so as not to be taken by surprise, and every night withdrew his men to his ships. It was during this day, the Feast of St. Elmo, that the Turks captured the Ravelin. Even the knights who were in St. Elmo's garrison do not quite know how it happened, but the general opinion is that it occurred as follows. All night long the bombardment had continued, and even though their trenches were very close to the Ravelin, the Turks had not suffered any casualties from the defenders' fire. It is likely, therefore, that their engineers went out along the ditch to see what effect their bombardment was having. They could not go along the shoulder of the fortification, even though given continuous covering fire by their arquebusiers. Now, to their great amazement, those engineers got quite close to the Ravelin without being discovered. Going on still further, it seems likely that they either found the sentry asleep or saw that the Ravelin was only defended by a few soldiers. Therefore, they gave a signal to the Janissaries, who made so sudden an attack that the guard was taken by surprise. They withdrew in confusion to a trench which lay between the tower and the Ravelin. Now this trench was held by 50 soldiers who had been posted there to give the defenders help should they need it. Yet so fierce was the Turkish assault that our men were forced to abandon the whole of the Ravelin. The Turks stormed into it in the greatest numbers through one of our embrasures, while the defenders retreated into the fort. This action was marked by great bravery on both sides. Many knights and soldiers rushed out from Fort St. Elmo, led by the bailiff of Negrepont, to defend the Ravelin, but they found it heavily occupied since the Turks had already captured the trench. The Turkish numbers increased steadily as they fought to hold the ground that they had gained, while our men strove to regain what they had lost. A bitter fight ensued, which was more than a brief engagement. It was a real battle, and the hand-to-hand fighting went on for 5 hours. In the end, however, our troops were forced to retire, for the whole Turkish army was coming up. They were sure that this was the day when they were destined to capture St. Elmo. It speaks greatly for the bravery of our troops that the Turks did not succeed. Indeed, during the confused fighting, some of the knights who were in the battle admit that as they re-entered St. Elmo, they forgot to pull up the drawbridge behind them. It had long been clear that the Ravelin could not really be defended, although its exterior defence had been completed on the lines ordered by La Valette, and Juan de la Cerda had already given it as his opinion that it ought to be mined so that the Turks would be blown up when they captured it. All the same, the Turks did not capture it easily or quickly. After they had occupied the Ravelin, they moved into the ditch in a confused mass through a breach in the outer defences. Our troops immediately opened fire on them from St. Elmo and the Tower of Sagra. If St. Elmo had been built with embrasures for traversing fire, few Turks who entered the ditch would have escaped. We later learned from renegades that 500 of the best Turkish troops were killed in the assault on the Ravelin. For our part, we lost 60 soldiers and 20 knights, and had many wounded, among them the bailiff of Negrepont and Don Francisco de Guevara. The bailiff had an arrow in the leg, and Don Francisco a bullet wound. The loss of the Ravelin, even though it had cost the enemy dearly, greatly distressed the Grand Master, since it had been due to our own negligence. Our boats were soon transporting the wounded over to the infirmary in Birgu, a practice that the Grand Master continued as long as was possible, but the garrison was kept at full strength, for during the night, La Valette dispatched knights and soldiers to St. Elmo to take the place of the dead and wounded. The luckiest of the coxswains of the boats engaged on this ferry service was a Genoese called Arbenga, his boat sustaining only one casualty, Pagao, a Maltese serving brother. The losses in the other boats were considerable. The night following the capture of the Ravelin, the Turks began to increase its height with goat skins packed with earth. It was not long before they had raised it to the same height as the walls of St. Elmo, even though our troops sallied out by the ditch and seized some of the skins. On this same night, the Chevalier Salvago reached Malta and landed at St. Elmo. He and Captain Andres de Miranda inspected the fort together before going over to Birgu. They crossed before dawn under fire from the enemy trenches, one of their boat's crew being killed. The next day, La Valette sent Salvago back to Sicily with news of the loss of the Ravelin. He instructed him to make arrangements for sending a relief force. Throughout this period, there were constant skirmishes between the enemy and the cavalry based on Medina. Our cavalry was composed of knights, foreign troops, and Maltese. On one occasion, Captain Guaras, who was now recovered, having located an enemy foraging party in a village called Mostar, went out with 60 horsemen and a number of arquebusiers. Falling upon the Turks, he captured some and killed others, cutting off their heads and sending them to Medina. On another occasion, learning that the Turks were carrying off a great deal of livestock and corn, he sallied out with 80 horsemen and 40 arquebusiers to protect the Maltese who were bringing their corn into the city. Having sent a dispatch to the governor for reinforcements, Captain Guaras set off towards the villages of Mostar and Nashar in the direction of the enemy. The Turks, who were in position of advantage, charged our cavalry, but at this moment the knight Juan Vanyan arrived with 80 arquebusiers sent by the governor. Guaras accordingly determined to attack the enemy on both flanks. This move was so successful that the Turks were forced to abandon their booty and retreat in disorder, losing over 80 men in wounded and prisoners. Guaras fought extremely bravely but received an arrow wound in the hand while holding his lance. Vanyan also acquitted himself well, as did Vincenzo Ventura. The latter was in command of 25 arquebusiers and managed to capture a Turkish standard. In this engagement, our losses were 5 dead and 30 wounded. End of chapter 4.